At dinner, my brother grinned his money is my money. I never have to worry. I let him finish and replied, you just bet your future on money that doesn't belong to you. By morning, everyone knew the truth. By the time my brother started bragging, I'd already spent most of my adult life being the quiet one in my family. The one who handled things smooth, things over, paid when something needed paying, and didn't ask for applause afterward. I wasn't invisible. Exactly. I was just useful. And when you're useful long enough, people stop seeing where you end, and what you provide begins. It started at a bar I didn't even want to be at. One of those places with warm lighting, overpriced drinks, and music just loud enough to force everyone to lean in and talk over each other. My brother Evan had insisted we come out with his friends. Just one night, he said, like it was some rare favor he was doing me. I remember standing there with a glass I hadn't touched, watching him hold cord at the center of the table, laughing too loudly, slapping shoulders, telling stories that weren't quite lies, but weren't the truth either. I recognized the rhythm of it. I'd seen this version of him my entire life. Evan is 2 years younger than me, and if you ask my parents, he's the charismatic one, the people person, the guy who knows how to enjoy life. I was always the responsible one, the planner, the one who thought ahead. Growing up, that difference turned into a family joke and then into a family expectation. Evan needed help. I helped. Evan messed up. I covered. Evan needed money for something temporary. I floated it. No one ever said this out loud, but it became understood. Zane would take care of it. Zane always does. So when Evan started talking about our money, I noticed it the way you notice a crack forming in glass, quietly, carefully. Like if I didn't move, maybe it wouldn't spread. One of his friends asked about a recent trip Evan had taken, something expensive and spontaneous. Evan grinned and waved his hand like it was nothing. Family takes care of this stuff, he said, leaning back in his chair. That's just how we're set up. A couple of them nodded, impressed. Someone laughed and said I must be lucky. Evan didn't look at me when he replied. He just kept going. Yeah, man, we've always done it this way. It's basically shared. What's mine is his, what's his is mine. That kind of thing. I sat there listening, feeling something tighten behind my ribs, because that wasn't true. Not really. It had never gone both ways. I could count on one hand the number of times Evan had covered something for me, and I wouldn't even need all my fingers. But I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. I took a sip of my drink and stared at the condensation on the glass, reminding myself that this wasn't the place that calling him out here would just turn into a scene. And scenes had a way of circling back to me somehow being the problem. As the night went on, the stories got bigger. Evan talked about investments he hadn't made, connections he didn't really have, plans he was working on that were vague enough to sound impressive without ever becoming concrete. Every so often, he'd loop me into it without actually involving me. Zane knows what I'm talking about, he'd say. Or we talked about this already. I hadn't, but I nodded anyway. Not because I agreed, but because I was suddenly curious how far he'd take it if no one stopped him. There was a moment somewhere between the second round and the third where one of his friends leaned toward me and said, half joking, must be nice being the financial brain behind the operation. I smiled thinly and said something non-committal. Inside, though, I felt that old familiar mix of frustration and resignation. This was the role, wasn't it? Silent partner, safety net, the guy whose name could be borrowed as long as it stayed abstract. What Evan didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the way my family talked about me when I wasn't in the room. The way my parents would say things like, well, Zane doesn't really need recognition, or, your brother means well. Every time Evan crossed a line, it was about how my contributions were treated as a given, while his intentions were treated like achievements. Sitting there in that bar, listening to him rewrite our reality in real time, something shifted. I started thinking back to all the small moments I'd brushed aside over the years, the times he'd volunteered my help without asking, the way my parents would look at me expectantly whenever Evan hit another rough patch, the casual confidence with which he spoke about resources he didn't control, as if proximity to me made them his by default. I realized maybe for the first time that correcting him wouldn't actually change anything. Not long term. He'd laugh it off. They always did. If anything was going to change, it wouldn't be because I spoke up in a crowded bar. So I stayed quiet. I let him talk. I let him build the image. I let his friends walk away thinking we were some kind of effortless team backed by a safety net that never ran out. And as the night dragged on, I noticed Evan growing more confident, more relaxed, like he'd convinced himself of his own story. He talked about future plans that leaned heavily on this invisible support, on assumptions that had never been tested. At one point, he raised his glass and said, honestly, I don't even worry about money anymore. Between family and how things are structured, I'm covered. He laughed, and everyone laughed with him. I didn't. I watched him instead, really watched him, and wondered what would happen when the structure he was bragging about stopped being theoretical. Because the thing Evan didn't know yet, the thing I hadn't shared with anyone at that table, was that the way we were set up had already changed. Not in some dramatic, explosive way. Quietly, legally, intentionally. I'd made decisions months earlier that I hadn't felt the need to announce because I didn't think they concerned anyone else. Sitting there listening to my brother speak so confidently about something that no longer existed the way he thought it did, I realized I was about to find out just how dependent he'd become on a version of me that wasn't there anymore. I didn't say a word. I just leaned back, folded my hands, and waited, knowing that sooner or later, the truth doesn't need help to catch up. It just needs time. The days after that night didn't calm anything down. If anything, it was like Evan's confidence had been fed instead of checked. He started calling more, texting more, showing up with assumptions instead of questions. At first, it was subtle, the way it always is with family. A casual message asking if I could spot him for a bit. A comment over dinner about how I was good with this stuff anyway. He didn't even pretend to be embarrassed anymore. It was said with the same tone you'd use to ask someone to pass the salt. What made it worse was how quickly my parents fell back into their roles. Like muscle memory, my mom would call me and talk around the issue before getting to the point. She always did that thing where she'd start with updates about neighbors or distant relatives, as if padding the conversation made the ask feel smaller. "Your brother's just under some pressure," she said one afternoon. "You know how he is. He just needs a little help until things settle." I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the clean counter I'd wiped down earlier that morning. I realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked how I was doing before asking what I could do for Evan. I said I'd think about it. She sighed, not dramatically, just enough to signal disappointment, and said, "Well, I hope you won't let family struggle if you can help." That word struggle sat wrong with me. Evan wasn't struggling. He was spending. There was a difference. The favoritism wasn't loud. It never had been. It was quiet and constant, like background noise you only notice when it stops. If Evan missed a deadline or messed something up, it was stress, bad timing, someone else's fault. If I hesitated even once, it was questioned, analyzed, remembered. I started noticing how often my parents framed my boundaries as problems and his expectations as needs. A week later, Evan invited me to dinner. "Just the two of us," he said. I almost laughed when he said it would be nice to catch up because we hadn't drifted apart. I just stopped automatically saying yes to everything. Still, I went. Part of me wanted to believe this was him reaching out. Another part of me wanted to see what angle he was taking now. We sat at a place he liked, somewhere familiar enough that the staff greeted him by name. He ordered confidently, without looking at prices. Halfway through the meal, he leaned back and sighed like he was exhausted. "Man," he said, "I don't know how you do it. Always so calm. I feel like everything's on my shoulders lately." I waited. I'd learned that if you didn't feel the silence, Evan would. "I've got some opportunities coming up," he continued. "Big ones. But you know how it is. You need a little runway. I was thinking maybe we could move some things around." "Temporarily," he said. Temporarily, the way people say, "don't worry," as if the word itself was a guarantee. I asked him what he meant by move things around. He blinked, genuinely confused. "You know," he said, gesturing vaguely, "accounts access just until things stabilize." The casualness of it caught me off guard. He wasn't asking to borrow anymore. He was talking like it was already agreed upon, like the only thing left was logistics. I told him I wasn't comfortable with that. I kept my voice even calm. I said it wasn't personal, just a boundary. The way his expression changed was immediate. The easy smile slipped, his shoulders tensed. "Are you serious?" he asked. "After everything, you're really going to act like this?" That was the first time it hit me that in his mind my support wasn't generosity. It was obligation. When I didn't immediately back down, he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Wow," he said. "I guess I shouldn't be surprised. You've always been like this, holding things over people." I reminded him of the times I'd helped, the money I'd fronted, the things I'd quietly taken care of, so he wouldn't have to deal with consequences. He waved it off. "That's what family does," he said. "You don't keep score." It was the same line he'd used at the bar, but this time it felt sharper, like a shield. The conversation spiraled from there. He accused me of changing, of being distant, of thinking I was better than everyone else now. None of it was true, but I realized facts didn't matter. What mattered was that I was no longer playing my part the way he expected. When the check came, he didn't even look at it. He slid it toward me automatically, then froze when I didn't reach for it. "You're really doing this?" he asked, voice low. I paid for my half and stood up. The look on his face wasn't anger yet, it was disbelief. That night my phone lit up with messages. Not from Evan, but from my parents. He'd gotten to them first. My dad's message was short and disappointed. "Your brother tells us you embarrassed him tonight." My mom's was longer, full of concern and confusion and that familiar undercurrent of guilt. "He's hurting Zane. He feels like you're pulling away. We raised you better than this. Raised me better than what, setting limits." Expecting honesty? I didn't reply right away. I needed time to process how quickly the narrative had turned, how easily I'd been cast as the villain for not opening my wallet on command. The real breaking point came a few days later at a family gathering I almost skipped. It was supposed to be casual, just dinner at my parents' place. I walked in already tense, and it didn't take long to see that something was off. Conversation stopped when I entered the room. Evan barely looked at me. My mom kept glancing between us, nervous. Halfway through the meal, my dad cleared his throat, so he said too deliberately, "Your brother's been telling us about some concerns." Evan finally looked up, then eyes fixed on his plate. My dad continued, "He says there's been some confusion about finances, about commitments." I felt my pulse spike. This wasn't a private conversation. This was an ambush. "What kind of commitments?" I asked. Evan spoke before my dad could answer. "The ones you made," he said. He looked up at me now, expression hard. "The ones you're backing out of." My mom nodded faintly, like she was trying to keep the peace by agreeing with whoever spoke last. I asked him to be specific. He hesitated, then said it. He told them I'd promised to help fund his next venture, that I'd agreed to support him while he got it off the ground, that he'd already told people it was handled. None of it was true. He'd taken assumptions, casual conversations, and spun them into guarantees. And he'd done it knowing exactly how it would sound coming from me. I looked at my parents, waiting for someone to question it, to ask when this promise had been made. No one did. My mom just said, "Well, if that's what you said, Zane, your brother relied on that." The room felt smaller. I realized in that moment that it didn't matter what I'd actually done. What mattered was the version of me they'd all built in their heads. I told them I'd never made that promise. Evan scoffed. "So now I'm lying," he said in front of everyone. My dad frowned at me. "Why would he make that up?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. That question landed harder than any accusation, because it showed me exactly where the benefit of the doubt lived in our family. I tried to explain to slow it down, but the damage was done. Evan stood up, voice raised just enough to draw attention. "I told people you had my back," he said. "I told them family takes care of each other, and now you're making me look like an idiot." He didn't mention the money directly. He didn't have to. The implication hung there, heavy and unmistakable. I left shortly after, heart pounding, mind racing. In the days that followed, I started hearing about things Evan had said behind my back. That I'd changed, that I was hoarding resources, that I promised support, and pulled it away at the last second. Friends of the family stopped reaching out. Conversations grew strained. The pressure wasn't subtle anymore. It was coordinated. And then late one evening, I received a message that made my stomach drop. A screenshot forwarded from someone I barely knew. It was Evan in a group chat talking about our setup again. Talking about money that wasn't his, talking about timelines and access like decisions had already been made. Except this time, he wasn't just bragging. He was making commitments in my name. I stared at the screen for a long time, realizing that this wasn't just disrespect anymore. It was a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. And for the first time, I understood that staying quiet wasn't keeping the peace. It was enabling something that was about to blow up. After that screenshot, things didn't explode right away. They collapsed slowly, which in some ways was worse. There was no single dramatic confrontation, no shouting match that cleared the air. Instead, there was distance, silence, a quiet rewiring of how people treated me. Like a memo had gone out that I hadn't been copied on. Calls stopped coming in unless someone needed clarification on something Evan had said. Messages felt cautious, transactional. Friends of the family who used to joke with me suddenly spoke like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. I could feel it everywhere. This subtle shift where I was no longer the dependable constant, but the problem variable. The worst part was my parents. My mom stopped calling altogether for a while, and when she finally did, her tone was careful in a way that made my chest tighten. She talked to me like I was volatile, like I might snap if she phrased something wrong. My dad, when he did reach out, kept things brief and impersonal. Updates, logistics, no warmth, no curiosity about my side of things. It hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent years telling myself I didn't need validation from them, that I was fine being the steady one in the background. But when that background role was stripped away and replaced with suspicion, I realized how much of my identity had been tied up and being needed. When that was gone, there was a hollow space where certainty used to be. There were nights I sat alone in my apartment, lights off, replaying conversations in my head, wondering if I should have corrected Evan sooner, if staying quiet had been a mistake, if I'd somehow caused this by not drawing lines earlier. That kind of thinking is dangerous because it turns self-reflection into self-blame. I started questioning things that had never been up for debate before. My judgment, my values, my worth. Financially, I was fine, better than fine actually. But emotionally, I felt stripped down, exposed. I'd built my sense of contribution around what I could provide for others. And now that I wasn't providing in the way they expected, I felt purposeless. I didn't like admitting that to myself. It sounded weak, but it was honest. Evan didn't reach out during that time, not directly. I heard about him through others, about how stressed he was, about how unfair this all was for him, about how he'd been counting on things that now weren't happening. Every story was framed like a tragedy, where he was the victim of sudden abandonment. No one mentioned the assumptions he'd made, the promises he'd invented, the way he'd spoken for me without ever asking. I hit what I call my low point a few weeks after everything went quiet. I'd had a rough day at work. Nothing dramatic, just the kind that drains you. I came home, dropped my keys on the counter, and realized there was no one to talk to about it. Not because I lacked people, but because the people who had always been there were now distant, conditional. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly alone. That night, I didn't distract myself. No background noise, no scrolling, no numbing. I sat with it, and somewhere between frustration and sadness, something shifted. I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. If I stripped away what I did for my family, who was I left with? Not what could I provide, not how useful I was, just me. The answer didn't come all at once. It came in small, uncomfortable realizations. I was competent. I was disciplined. I'd built stability quietly without applause. I'd made choices that protected my future even when it wasn't popular. None of that disappeared just because someone decided to resent me for it. I started rebuilding, but not in the way people usually imagine. There was no dramatic transformation montage, no big announcements. I rebuilt internally first. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. I stopped preemptively defending boundaries I was allowed to have. I let some calls go unanswered. I let some assumptions sit uncorrected. I also started putting energy back into parts of my life I'd neglected. I took on a project at work that I'd been putting off because it required focus and risk. I said yes to opportunities that had nothing to do with my family. I spent time with people who knew me as Zane, not as a role, not as a resource. The more I did that, the clearer things became. I could see the pattern now stretched across years. How my reliability had been mistaken for obligation. How my silence had been interpreted as consent. How Evan in particular had built his confidence on the assumption that I would always be there to catch him. Seeing it didn't make it hurt less, but it made it make sense. There was a strange relief in that pain with context is easier to carry. Evan eventually did reach out, but not the way you'd expect. He sent a message late one night that was long and carefully worded. He talked about misunderstandings about stress, about how things had gotten blown out of proportion. He didn't apologize. Not really. He framed everything as unfortunate timing and emotional reactions. He asked if we could reset and move forward. I didn't respond right away. I read it a few times, noticing what wasn't there. No acknowledgement of the lies, no ownership of the damage, just a desire to restore the setup that had benefited him. I realized then that reconciliation as he understood it meant me stepping back into my old place. Quiet, supportive, available. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no either. I said I needed time. That answer didn't go over well. Within days, the pressure returned, subtle at first, then less so. My mom called voice tight, asking why I was dragging things out. My dad hinted that holding grudges wasn't healthy. Evan's name came up in conversations like a fragile thing I was expected to protect. But something had changed in me. The guilt didn't land the same way anymore. I could hear it for what it was. Discomfort with a system that no longer worked the way it used to. And instead of scrambling to fix that discomfort, I let it exist. Quietly, I made more decisions. Practical ones, protective ones. I reviewed arrangements I'd set up years ago, ones I'd never thought twice about because they'd always been framed as temporary or flexible. I adjusted things, clarified things not out of spite, but out of necessity. If my name was going to be used, it was going to be used accurately or not at all. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. There was no need. The less noise I made, the more clearly I could see who reacted to what. And I noticed something interesting. The people who valued me reached out without conditions. The ones who didn't. By the time Evan realized I wasn't going to fold, I was no longer the same person who'd sat silently at that bar. I wasn't angry. I wasn't eager for confrontation. I was steady in a different way now, grounded in something that didn't depend on being needed by people who took me for granted. The real rise, I think, was internal. I stopped measuring my worth by how much peace I could keep for others. I started measuring it by how much peace I could keep for myself. And that's when I got the message that changed everything. Not from Evan, from someone else. Someone who'd been in that group chat. Someone who assumed I already knew. The message was short, almost casual, but it carried a weight that made my hands go cold as I read it. It said, "Hey, just a heads up. Evan told a few people tonight that things are officially locked in on your end. He's acting like it's already done." I stared at the screen, the words blurring slightly, and realized that whatever quiet rebuilding I'd been doing was about to collide head-on with the version of reality Evan had been selling to everyone else. That message didn't make me angry right away. What it did was clarify something that had been hovering in the background for weeks. Evan hadn't learned anything. Not really. He hadn't reflected or adjusted or questioned his assumptions. He'd just changed tactics. Instead of asking, he was declaring. Instead of pressuring me directly, he was letting momentum and social expectation do the work for him. And that told me everything I needed to know. For the first time since this whole thing started, I didn't feel confused. I felt focused. I didn't respond to the message immediately. I sat with it, phone face down on the table, and let the implications settle. Evan wasn't just talking loosely anymore. He was committing me publicly to arrangements I had never agreed to. He was staking his credibility on access to things he did not control. And he was doing it confidently, because in his experience, confidence had always been enough. Someone else, usually me, would clean up the mess later. Except this time there was no mess to clean up. There was only a collision waiting to happen. The next morning, I did something I probably should have done years ago. I wrote everything down. Not emotionally, not dramatically. Just facts, dates, conversations, messages, the times I had helped, the times I had said no, the times Evan had spoken for me. I didn't do it because I planned to confront him right away. I did it because clarity is power, and I was done operating in the fog of other people's narratives. As I laid it all out, patterns jumped off the page. Evan's confidence spikes always followed my silence. His biggest promises were always made in rooms where I wasn't present, or where social pressure made it awkward to contradict him. And my parents' disappointment always followed his version of events, never a neutral one. It wasn't malicious in a movie villain way. It was entitlement reinforced by years of being indulged. Once I saw that the setup became less about revenge and more about inevitability, I started quietly reaching out to a few people, not to gossip, not to complain, just to clarify people who mattered, people whose opinions carried weight in the same circles Evan had been bragging in. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't trash him. I simply corrected assumptions calmly, factually. No, that's not accurate. That hasn't been agreed to. I'm not involved in that. The reactions were subtle but telling. Confusion, surprise, a few awkward pauses. One person actually laughed, thinking I was joking until they realized I wasn't. That was when I knew Evan had been speaking with absolute certainty. Not hypothetical plans, not maybe. Certainty. At the same time, I tightened my own circle. I stopped sharing details about my life with my family beyond surface-level updates. I didn't announce decisions. I didn't explain changes. I simply made them. The less information they had, the less they could reinterpret. My parents noticed, of course. My mom asked why I seemed distant. My dad commented that I was being formal. I didn't argue. I didn't justify. I said I was busy and left it at that. It was remarkable how unsettling that was for them. They were used to access, used to commentary, used to being part of the process. My quiet refusal to engage felt to them like rebellion. Evan tried again, more directly this time. He called me late one evening, voice too upbeat. Hey, he said like nothing was wrong. We need to sync up. Some timelines are moving faster than expected. I asked him what timelines he meant. There was a pause, just a fraction of a second too long. Then he launched into it. Deals, expectations, people waiting on confirmation. He spoke fast, stacking assumptions on top of each other, trying to overwhelm me with inevitability. It was the same tactic he'd always used, just louder now. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt. When he finally stopped to breathe, I said, I'm not part of that. Just that. No explanation. He went quiet, then defensive, then indignant. You can't do this, he said. People are counting on it. The irony almost made me smile. People were counting on my resources without my consent, and somehow that was my problem. I told him he shouldn't be promising things that weren't his to promise. He snapped back that I was embarrassing him, that I was making him look unreliable. I almost corrected him, almost told him that he'd done that himself. Instead, I said, you did that when you spoke for me. That was the first time he got angry. Not performative frustration, real anger. He accused me of sabotaging him, of being jealous of holding power over him just to prove I could. I listened detached because I recognized the desperation underneath. His version of reality was starting to crack, and he didn't know how to hold it together without me reinforcing it. After that call, I knew the timing mattered. If I confronted him directly, he'd spin it. If I announced anything publicly, it would look reactive. The only move that made sense was patience. I kept preparing quietly, methodically. I double-checked. Everything that had my name attached to it. Anything ambiguous I clarified. Anything informal I formalized. Anything that relied on assumptions I removed. It wasn't dramatic, it was administrative, which in some ways made it more final. There would be no room for interpretation when the moment came. I also noticed something else during this time. People started asking me questions. Evan used to answer for me directly without going through him. That told me his authority was already slipping. Confidence without substance only works until someone checks. The final piece of the setup came from an unexpected place. A mutual acquaintance reached out. Someone who had been impressed by Evan's stories and had started asking practical questions. Numbers, access, timelines. Evan apparently had deferred. Zane will handle that part, he'd said. I was asked politely to confirm. I read the message slowly. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't rumor. This was a direct test of the story Evan had been telling, and I realized that I didn't need to expose him. I didn't need to confront him publicly. I didn't need to do anything dramatic at all. All I had to do was tell the truth, but not yet, because timing is everything. And Evan was still talking, still bragging, still laughing about our money and how we're set up, still borrowing my name like it was his shield. I let him. I let the expectations grow. I let the commitment stack up. I let the moment ripen, knowing that when reality finally asserted itself, it wouldn't need my anger to make the point. It would speak for itself. And as I watched him build higher and higher on a foundation he didn't own, I knew exactly when I would stop staying quiet. Just not yet. The moment arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, quietly without ceremony. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, just an email. It was from the same acquaintance who had asked me to confirm Evan's claims. The subject line was neutral professional, next steps, and confirmation. I read it once, then again, making sure I understood what was being asked. They wanted written confirmation that I was backing the arrangement Evan had described. Not verbally, not implied, written, dated, traceable. I replied within 15 minutes. I kept it short, polite, precise. I thanked them for reaching out, clarified that there had been a misunderstanding, and stated plainly that I was not involved. had never agreed to be involved, and would not be participating in any financial or operational capacity. I didn't mention Evan's name, I didn't accuse, I didn't explain, I simply told the truth. I hit send, closed my laptop, and went back to work. The fallout didn't hit immediately. It rippled outward like it always does when something people assumed was solid, suddenly isn't. By that evening, my phone was buzzing. Missed calls, messages that started with confusion and ended with urgency. Evan called 3 times in a row. I didn't answer. When I finally did respond, it was by text. I told him the truth. I wrote nothing more. That was when his world cracked. He showed up at my place the next morning without warning. I opened the door, saw his face, and immediately understood how deep this went. He wasn't angry anymore. He was panicked. His confidence was gone, replaced by that tight, hollow look people get when they realize the ground they've been standing on was never stable to begin with. "What did you do?" he asked, voice low. I clarified. I said I didn't invite him in. I didn't need to. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing just outside my doorway. "You couldn't just talk to me first," he demanded. "You had to go behind my back." I almost laughed at that. "You mean the way you talk for me behind my back?" I asked. My voice was calm, steady. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't emotional. That seemed to unsettle him more than anger ever would have. "You knew people were counting on this," he said. "You made me look like I don't know what I'm doing." "No," I replied. "You did that? You just didn't expect anyone to check." He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, there was nothing he could say that reframed the situation in his favor. No vague promises, no shared language, no family takes care of its shield. Just facts, standing where his assumptions used to be. He tried a different angle then. Apologies, sort of. He said he hadn't meant for it to go that far, that he thought I'd come around like I always did, that he'd already told people things were handled because that was how it usually went. Hearing it out loud was sobering. Not because it was new information, but because it was finally honest. "I'm not your safety net," I told him. "I never agreed to be. You decided that for me." He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just stood there deflated, realizing that whatever version of me he built his plans on no longer existed. The rest unraveled quickly after that. People started asking questions Evan couldn't answer. Timelines he'd promised suddenly needed revision. Access he'd implied turned out not to exist. The credibility he'd borrowed from my name evaporated overnight. It wasn't malicious on my part. I didn't call anyone to expose him. I didn't post anything. I simply refused to reinforce a lie. My parents called later that week, shaken and defensive in equal measure. My mom asked why I hadn't told them sooner that things had changed. I told her they hadn't asked. My dad wanted to know why I'd let it get this far. I told him I hadn't been the one making promises. That was the first real conversation we'd had in years. It wasn't pleasant. There were long pauses, defensive questions, attempts to soften what Evan had done by reframing it as optimism or ambition. I didn't accept any of it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I stated what had happened and what I would no longer allow. Something shifted then, not dramatically, but enough. For the first time, they listened without interrupting. For the first time, they couldn't default to assuming I'd smooth it over because there was nothing left to smooth. Evan stopped calling after that. Not out of spite, I think, but out of embarrassment. The kind that forces reflection whether you want it or not. We didn't speak for months. When we finally did, it was cautious, distant. He didn't ask for help. He didn't brag. He didn't talk about our money. The illusion was gone, and with it the entitlement. As for me, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. The revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was simply the removal of access. The refusal to be used as a backdrop for someone else's confidence. Watching the consequences land wasn't satisfying because he suffered. It was satisfying because the truth finally stood on its own without me carrying it. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. Some relationships didn't recover. Others improved in small, meaningful ways. I learned who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide. I learned that silence can be powerful, but only when it's chosen, not assumed. And the next time I sat across from someone and heard them talk confidently about things that weren't theirs, I didn't feel the need to interrupt. I knew better now because the strongest correction isn't confrontation. It's letting reality speak and no longer volunteering to translate it for someone who never listened in the first place.